Alrighty, everybody. Thanks for joining us for another episode here of Road to Emporia. A special guest today in Robert Chung, the inventor of virtual elevation, the Chung Method, whatever name Robert wants to call it. So Robert is a professor at UC Berkeley, correct? And a mathematician and tomographer. Yeah. Am I getting that right? Awesome. So we thought we'd have you on and kind of bring us through virtual elevation, how we can test equipment at home, kind of give us some tips and tricks and some tests that we did recently, what we did wrong, and how we can do it a little bit
Travis,
better.
Why don't you tell me what you were trying to do, what you were trying to test, and then we can that'd be an interesting way to jump into this thing.
Yeah, so we went through and wanted to test what the fastest size of gravel tire is. We picked what we thought was kind of a middle-of-the-road gravel path. We went to an apple orchard, found a loop that was about a half mile long, did 10 laps, and really we had already gone to the wind tunnel and tested the CdA of the 35, 40, and 45 mil tire. So what we wanted to do and go and see the little bit of penalty we saw for going to a wider tire, can we make up for that in rolling resistance to get a lower total drag? So I think you have the files and everything. So I just want to clarify. That was kind of what we were testing.
For the audience, that you sent me these files, and they were blind. I didn't know that there were 3 different tires. I didn't know that you'd been to a wind tunnel. I didn't know that this was so this was like, in some ways, a blind test. And, you sprung it on you. And I took those 3 files that you sent me, and I put them into Golden Cheetah. And then I realized that it would probably be better if I stitched them together into one big file. So I merged them using Golden Cheetah, and I merged those 3 files together. And then I displayed them using the Aero Lab module in Golden Cheetah. And then I could actually see some interesting things. So I exported the data, and I did a graph of that merged file. And I actually have a copy of the graphic that I sent you, so maybe I should share that. Yeah. Okay.
It looks like it's coming up now.
So I took your 3 files, I stitched them together. You can see it's in kilometers at the bottom. So you did 25 kilometers, but they were actually, I don't know whether you use metric or if you use imperial, but that was, each one of these things was about, you did 10 laps, so they were about half a mile, so they were about 5 miles. So you can count and you can actually see the laps that you were doing. And you could see that the virtual elevation method actually picks up, you can count those peaks, and it looks like you did 10 laps for each of those 3 tires. I put little red lines down to separate the 35 millimeter from the 40 millimeter from the 45 millimeter tires. And then I did a hypothetical. And at this point, when you sent it to me, it was blind. I think the only thing I asked you was how much you weighed, all inclusive, you plus the bike plus any equipment that you had. So the 2 bits of information I had was that you had 3 runs. I did not at that moment know that you were using 3 different tires. So it was really minimal. And I plotted them, and what you can see here is that the leftmost set of tests have an upward slope. The middle group looks relatively flat, and now it's hard to see, but the rightmost group, actually, it's hard to see, but if you zoom in, they have a very, very slight upward slope. And so immediately, even without knowing anything else, I knew that the total drag for whatever that left-hand panel was higher than for the middle and for the right. And then when I zoomed in, I could tell that the drag for the right-hand panel was very slightly higher than for the middle one. So that's what virtual elevation can tell you. Now, without knowing any more information than that you just sent me 3 files and that I knew what your total mass was, I couldn't separate whether this was a change in CdA or a change in CRR, whether it was a change in the aerodynamic drag or a change in the rolling resistance drag, or some combination of the two. But I could tell that they were different.
Yeah.
And so that was already good information. Even with this very minimal amount of information you gave me, we can already tell something important. So that's good.
Yeah, that's great. I think easily the next step, or I think the logical question there is, well, how do we get in and separate CRR from CdA?
Right. So I think that after you sent me these data and after I plotted them, and because I said this was very minimal information that you supplied me, I think I asked you 2 questions, and you may recall the 2 questions I asked were, what power meter were you using, and did you have a speed sensor on your bike, or were you using GPS to get the speed? And what were the answers?
And I answered both of them poorly. So I was using a single-sided Stages power meter, and I was using GPS, not a speed sensor.
So it turns out that this method, when performed carefully and with a dedicated speed sensor and with a reliable power meter, gives very precise answers. So the best I've ever seen, actually, is a test that Tom Anholt had done. And the standard deviation on the estimate that of aerodynamic drag of CdA, not CRR, but CdA, was 0.0006 meters squared. That's 6/10,000ths of a meter squared. And that is equivalent, actually, to 1 square inch.
That's impressive.
So that was the kind of precision that we can get when you have a good power meter and a good speed sensor. GPS speed is fine for long distances and for straight lines. But when you're doing loops and laps like this, at both high speed and low speed, and next to an apple orchard, or, in my case, sometimes next to tall buildings, then sometimes the GPS signal gets interrupted, and so you'll get one observation which looks like you're going slow, and then the very next observation looks like you're going really fast. On average, over many observations, it's fine, but that difference between adjacent observations is actually information that we use in virtual elevation because we're calculating the acceleration.
Yeah.
So it turns out that probably the best improvement you can do in order to improve the quality of these estimates is to get a cheap speed sensor, and those things cost like $20. And you put them on a wheel, and then you calibrate it, and the information you get from a dedicated speed sensor really improves the estimates. So I recommend that. Now, I don't want to put down single-sided power meters because they're fine for training, they're fine for lots of purposes. But for this particular purpose, In order to get precision, we need to have accuracy and power over the entire range and entire spectrum of power that people put out, from low power and low speed up to high power and high speed. And you know this, with a single side, your balance can often change. This is a normal thing, whether you're at low power at near your threshold or, when you're sprinting. Your balance can change a little bit. And we rely on accuracy across the entire spectrum. So in an ideal world, if these prices were the same, I would advise you to get something that measures the total power. It doesn't need to be both sides, because I don't really use, this doesn't use left-right, but total power is what you need. But that's probably out of the budget of most people. So I would say in that case, do what you need to do. If you already have a single-sided power meter, then you just use a single-sided power meter. But in that case, then the speed sensor becomes even more critical, because now you're going to rely on the speed to try and make up for only measuring one side of the power meter. Does that make sense?
Okay. Yeah. No, absolutely. And I think that's a really good takeaway for our listeners too, to see what kind of equipment they can do it with. What, like many things in life, having the nicest and most expensive thing makes a lot of things easier. But how do we do it if maybe that's a little bit different? So I already had a speed sensor on order, so it is on the bike, ready to go for the next test. And then I did manage to get access to another power meter. So I'm probably gonna actually try to do both and see how close we can get with the single-sided versus a dual-sided. But if you on the power meter side of things, can you go into types of power meters that are best? I mean, if you single versus double-sided, you have spindle, you have spider, you have pedals. That seems to be growing. A new brand pops up all the time in the pedal side of things, but I know that has another.
So I can talk about something about
piece to it, I guess.
The quality of the data, and I don't really care where. I mean, I have a slight preference. It's easier for me. I developed this algorithm. I developed this protocol with the late lamented, venerable and venerated Power Tap rear hub. And the rear hub was kind of nice because it was, from my perspective, clean. You didn't worry about the drivetrain. Anything that happened along the chain, anything that happened along the crank, I didn't care about. The rear hub was closest to the physics of the things that I'm trying to measure. But that is no longer, the Power Tap hubs are no longer being made. I tend to prefer either crank spider or pedals. An info crank, would be fine. Now, the problem with the info crank, of course, is that they're really expensive, but they give nice, clean data. But crank spider power meters like the Quark or the Power to Max, they're fine. They give good data. They give clean data. And so just from a data point of view, those would be my or SRM even. Once again, that's really expensive. But from a data quality point of view, they all produce good quality data. We talked earlier about the reality being that we all have limited budgets. We're not pros. No one is sponsoring. Maybe is anyone sponsoring you? Because no one sponsors me. I pay for it. So I actually do have to pay attention to how much stuff costs. So I would never tell anyone, you must go out and buy an SRM. You must go out and buy a Verve Info Crank. I think the reality is people are going to use the thing that they have. And what we're trying to do is to make the best with what they do have and to give them a good idea about what they can expect from the data from what they do have. And a single-sided crank, you're going to be able to do ballpark things. We can see from this graphic that you can already tell certain things from it. But from a single-sided crank, we may have difficulty diving down into the details to see whether that was a difference in CdA or a difference in CRR.
Okay. And I think we actually even have you have a method too that we can use without a power
actually,
meter.
I do have a method that
probably even less accuracy.
That thing really absolutely, because there's no power meter, it absolutely relies on accurate speed measurement. So that's a case where all the weight of what you're doing, these are power meterless coast downs down a shallow hill. And I've discussed this in my little presentation. But in that case, all of the information that you're trying to wean from these tests is going to come from the speed sensor. So that's absolutely a case where you want the speed sensor. Yeah. You want to measure a rollout of your tire very carefully, and you want to, get the speed done very carefully, because that's carrying all the weight of what you can explain.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think kind of what I'm gleaning from that, from an equipment side, what you need to start testing some of this stuff on your own at home, I'll say you need a speed sensor because the cost is so low. And if you're doing this stuff, you're probably spending a lot more money on the equipment that you're testing than the $20-$30 on a speed sensor. You're most likely going to have a power meter, but there's an option not to. And really any crank dual-sided or total or dual-sided power meter other than that, the one example of Shimano, that's going to get you the best data if you have a two-sided power meter.
Yeah, something that gives you total power.
And it doesn't matter whether it's pedal or crank or... Yeah. Okay. Awesome. Well, I think that makes it pretty easy to know what to do. As far as the different protocols, I guess we'll start with the Chung method if we want to go chunging. What do we need to look for in a course?
So I think that the most important thing is that it's a safe course, that you don't have to worry about cars or trucks or dogs or anything, that you have clean sight lines. But after safety, then the most important thing after safety is that it be either protected from the wind. I mean, we're talking about equipment. Now there are a few people who have Aero sensors, and Aero sensors don't relieve you of having to do a careful protocol, but they make it less onerous. So you don't have to wait until a dead calm day. Yeah. So I live next to San Francisco Bay, and the wind blows here all the time. When the wind blows in Japan, then 10 days later, it blows here. There are no buildings across the Pacific Ocean to slow it down. So so I look for either dead calm days, or else I look for places which are sheltered from the wind. And because I look for places that are sheltered from the wind, I have different protocols that depend on whether or not the place that's sheltered from the wind is flat, or if it's up a hill, or if it's a loop. So I originally developed this for a loop that was tree shaded. So it must be sort of like your apple orchard that had trees on both sides, and you had like a little road in between the trees, and that cuts down the wind quite a bit. But even more importantly, even if it doesn't cut down the wind entirely, the wind becomes predictable, because there may be a part of it which is more exposed and a little part of your road which was a little more covered or more exposed. But that's not going to change from lap to lap. It's always going to be more exposed in the same spot. It's always going to be more protected in the same spot. So that's sort of what we're looking for, something which is predictable. And even if it's not dead calm, at least it's predictably systematic. So that's what we look for. What we don't want it is for it to be gusty, or for lots of cars or buses or trucks to be passing by.
Yeah.
Because we can't, that's not systematic, that's not consistent. So another piece you were talking about was about braking because of your turns. So it depends on how much you have to brake. Braking is the one thing that we don't model very well. It doesn't mean that we couldn't. If we had some way to keep track of when you're using the brakes, and there are ways that we can do that. Then we can include that in the model. But for most people, it's better for them to slow down, to scrub off speed by stopping pedaling, and to slow down as much as they can, and then they can make that turn and they can accelerate again. So one of the things about this particular method is that you don't have to do constant speed and you don't have to do constant power. As a matter of fact, it's better if you don't do constant speed and power. So in my presentation, I actually talk about including coasting bits in your runs. So the coasting means you've got zero power, and then I can spot changes in speed having to do with changes in the elevation, assuming that you're holding your position right. So that increases the variability across the runs, and that improves the precision of the estimation. So as long as you don't...
Yeah, this loop that we had in the orchard was...
The orchard loop?
Go ahead. Yeah, so the loop we had it when we got out there was actually a little hillier than I was expecting it to be. So it worked out really well where I could go a little harder up the hill, and I kind of tried to make sure that the power was similar lap to lap. Actually, all three of these runs were within a watt of each other.
Yeah, so so people do
for
that.
The average power.
I'm going to interrupt you, and I'm going to say two things. There was like 10 meters worth of variation, roughly 10 meters of variation across each half-mile loop, which is not bad. But it turns out that you can allow your power and speed to vary much more than a watt per lap. So I think that many people who are used to doing experiments are not used to trusting the power meter and trusting the speed sensor. But a good power meter and a good speed sensor are so accurate, you don't need to keep lap to lap average power close. You can do a couple of laps really slowly, and you can do a couple of laps as fast as you can that will still allow you to coast around the turns. So in this case, the limitation is going to be, can you make that turn without hitting the brake?
Yeah.
I actually do a thing where I will start off a couple of laps and I will be ramping up my speed until I can just barely make the turns without hitting the brakes, and then I let my power and speed reduce. Excuse me.
Mm-hmm.
So I get a lot of range in speed and power across the laps.
Okay. Awesome. Yeah, I think that's the only other ones I've done in the past, the trying to hold a constant power the entire time is really difficult. Yeah, this one is basically ride up, coast down, make the turn, ride up, coast down, make the turn. So, but that's kind of your traditional loop
yes.
that you were looking for. Is there a length requirement?
So,
that
people do this on 200-meter velodromes. So I like to keep the laps at least 30 seconds in length.
Okay.
And I don't really see... I mean, when I first developed this, I was on a loop that had no traffic, so I didn't have much control. It was like a 2-mile loop. So my average times for these 2 miles went from maybe... Well, I'm slow. So it went from maybe 5 minutes up to like maybe 7 or 8 minutes. But... in an ideal world, a shorter lap lets you do more laps in a shorter amount of time, and more laps is sort of a good thing. Now, once you do more than 5 or 6 laps, you did 10 laps. You don't typically need to do 10 laps. If you did 5 or 6 laps, and if the laps were, say, 90 seconds or 2 minutes long, that's already 10 minutes. That's already 10 or, 10 minutes. And that's plenty. So the way I think about it, and I know that it's a little weird for a lot of people, but 10 minutes is 600 seconds, and that's 600 observations that I have. So my... observation unit is the second, not a run. So you've done 3 runs here, but my observations are actually based on the second. Now, because of the laps, I like to have multiple laps. I would say minimum 3 laps. Anything more than 3 laps, 4 laps, 5 laps is better. But once you get up beyond 5 laps or 600 seconds, or something like that, then additional data isn't really going to tell you much more. So if you're time limited, then you're looking for shorter laps. But, your lap is half a mile. Unless you can cut through the apple orchard, you're not going to cut it down much less than that. So I would have said half a mile is okay. Mine were 2 miles long. 2 miles was a long lap.
I think this... Yeah, I think that was the biggest thing I had trouble with finding, because we were interested in this particular one on CRR and rolling resistance. Well, we needed to find a gravel surface to do the testing on. Gravel roads are typically out in the middle of nowhere with really long stretches between turns. So finding something that was less than 4 miles, of a mile one direction and making a 4-corner turn, that was really difficult. So this half-mile loop was a lot easier to do.
So
than,
if you actually,
finding those 4, 5,
there's another
loops.
protocol, which is the out and back. And so if you did have a 1 mile out, you could turn that into a 1 mile out, turn around, and 1 mile back. And so you need to be a 4-mile loop. It's only a 1 mile out and back. And there are protocols for doing that also.
Yeah, let's go into that. I think that's a... Okay. Yeah, let's go into that one, because I think that's easy for people to find anywhere they go, especially if you're at an event or a race or whatever.
I want to say
on the course.
You're in Indiana,
to be able to pick a stretch and turn around.
Yeah, a 1 mile out
Yeah.
and back, it would be easy for you to find. A straight 1 mile out and back in, along San Francisco Bay
Yeah.
is actually hard to find.
Well, yeah. Mhm. Yeah. That is true. I was just I was out there a couple years ago. My sister used to live in right on Oakland Berkeley line, so I was just out there visiting her. So yeah, there weren't very many mile long straight stretches of road.
Actually, I know of one. I know of a couple, but there are very few. But so the reason why I have so many protocols, I have a loop protocol, I have an out and back protocol, I have a up a hill, a straight uphill protocol that doesn't use a downhill, is because there are these different terrain requirements, and so what I'm really looking for is something which is sheltered from the wind and has no traffic. And so those two things dictate what is usable, and that's why I have different protocols.
Okay. Well, let's go into the out and back and see. I guess we got the course right. 1 mile straight, right? No turns. Go out, turn around. How do you make that turn? I think that would be the first thing that would come to mind is how do I make a turn on a straight flat road with no brakes?
Ideally, you would have enough. You'd have enough room at the end at some point that you could turn around without using the brake. However, if that's not possible, then you can do another thing, which is that you can actually make a mark or use a tree or a garbage can or something, some landmark. And then once you hit that landmark, that tree stump or whatever, you hit the brakes and you hit it hard. And that will make a real clear mark. You don't actually have to take your hand off of the handlebars and hit the button on the Garmin or the Wahoo or whatever. You don't actually have to mark the lap. If you hit the brakes really hard after you pass your stump, that will make enough of a big enough jump in the virtual elevation. It'll look like you hit a wall. Then you can, now that you've hit the brake, you can turn around, you can stop, you can turn around, and then you can go back the other way. And then when you get home, you snip out that little braking event. Now, obviously, you don't want to do this 20 times.
Okay.
So the reason why I don't like to do out and backs on places where I can't do turnarounds, no braking turnarounds. I mean, I've done this so I could make sure that it would work. But the reason why I typically don't like it is because cutting and pasting out the little braking event is a pain in the rear. But it's possible. I mean, it's like if that's the only thing that you have, and you're doing only, say, 4 or 5 laps, then now if you're doing 4 or 5 laps, you're going to cut it like, at each end, you're taking like 8 snips. So that might take you 8 minutes, So it's not like one of the reasons why I think that this particular method, I like it, is not only because it's named after me, but another reason why I like it is because it's faster. You don't have to maintain speed and power at a constant thing. The laps can be shorter, and when I get home, then I may have to do more calculation, but I'm doing that while I'm sitting at the table, either drinking hot coffee or else a cold beer, depending on what time of year it is. So it makes the collection of the data faster, even if it makes the analysis of the data longer.
Yeah. Okay. So if to try to cut out that braking surface, if that out and back or braking event, if that out and back, one thing we do have here in a lot in the Midwest is some little bump, like a overpass or some little hill like that. If you can put a cone in the middle of the road and just coast up to that and make
perfect.
the turn,
that would be perfect.
That kind of gets you where you're not doing it, right? And then what about the same coming back? Do you just hit the lap?
I actually hardly ever use the lap marker because I have to take my hand off the handlebars. And I typically, when I'm doing this thing, I either get in the Aero bars or I lock my arms so that I can hold my head and my back and my shoulders in exactly the same position. So I don't like to take my hands out of the Aero bars or take my hands off the handlebars and hit the button, especially since I'm always forgetting which button that I've just hit, what I'm supposed to hit. And did I just hit the lap button or did I just hit the stop button? Which I don't remember. So looking at the data that you sent me, we can spot the laps. Spotting the laps is easy. Mm-hmm. We don't need to, just looking at the graphic, it was easy to identify the laps. So you'll be able to identify the turnaround. Yeah, so just drop a cone. If you can do that, coast up to the cone, and then if you need to brake, you need to brake,
Yeah. I think and I probably didn't ask it very well. So I'm talking about if you go out, you do your 1 mile, you found your little bump, so you're able to come back without braking, and you come back to the starting point. Well, now you want to do another lap. Do you need to find a little bowl to make that turn?
You can stop.
Can you stop?
Yeah, you can
position yourself again and then get going.
Yeah, no, you can do
if you
lap. Can make the turn without doing, then you can go out again, and now you've got one outbound, one inbound, another outbound, and another inbound, and so now you've got 4 runs over the same spot, over the same thing, and they're mirrored, right?
Okay. So
if there was a bump on the way out, you're going to hit the bump on the way back in. I think I have an example in my presentation where I can spot when I go over tree roots, and I can spot when I go over a little dip from a culvert. When I think in one of the early things I did, I was doing a loop, and I thought that the low point on the loop was in one spot, but when I was doing the virtual elevation profile for the loop, it showed a low spot someplace else, and I didn't recognize that. That seemed weird to me, but I knew that it was like 140 meters from a place where I made a turn. It was very consistent. It was like a low spot, like 140 meters from this spot. So I went out there, and I'll be damned, but 140 meters from that turn, on the side of the road, was a storm drain. So that was the low spot. That was where the water, they put in a storm drain. That was where the water was getting collected. So this is a good piece of information, which was this method is sensitive enough that when you see an anomaly, you can go out there and look, and if you see a storm drain or something, then you know. It was I had exactly the same thing many years later. I was in the Berkeley Oakland Hills, and I saw a bump where I didn't think that was the high spot, but I could tell, I could measure. It was very consistent in all my runs, and I went out there, and exactly in the spot where it seemed like it was the high spot, you look down, and you could tell that the utility water company had put in a valve underneath the street, and they put that valve there so that at the high spot, so that the water goes down in both directions. So no, it's pretty sensitive.
Yeah, no, spot on. Okay. So really, I think the out and back, we're looking for some place to make an easy turnaround, get a couple laps in, and then we can still go in and plug it into Golden Cheetah.
The only thing about Golden Cheetah is it's at this moment in this version, it does not have a mirroring function. So when I do an out and back, I can sort of do it. I have to eyeball it. If I were in Golden Cheetah, I actually export it into my own analytical software where I can mirror it. But any loop kind of thing, or multiple time up a hill, or you can do that with Golden Cheetah.
Okay. Well, let's do that in the single direction climb. So if you just have a climb,
so sometimes,
what kind of parameters
especially in the Berkeley Oakland hills, some of the downhills are too steep, so that when you're coming down, you have to use the brake. But you don't have to use the brake when you're going uphill. Isn't that amazing?
Not when you're going our speed.
Not when you're going our speed. You don't have to use the brakes when you're going uphill. So, so I do exactly the same thing. I start at the bottom of the hill, and I'll do one run really slowly, really low power, really slow. And it's like barely above walking speed. Then I'll do another run, which is medium. And then, so I'll do one run really slow, and then I'll roll back down using my brakes because it was a steep hill, back down to the bottom of the hill. And then I'll do another run, which is like medium speed. Then I get to the top and I turn around and I use my brakes going back down. And then the last time I will go at my threshold, or sometimes, depending on the length of the hill, super threshold. And so it's as fast as I can go. Now I've got 3 different runs at 3 different speeds and 3 different powers, but all on the same hill. And I've snipped out the coasting run back down to the bottom. And it turns out then that you can, once again, calculate the CRR and CdA from these 3 runs up the same hill at 3 widely different speeds and powers.
Okay. What kind of length and gradient
do
you look for there?
The gradient doesn't really matter as long as you can stay in the air. You don't want to stand. You don't want to be, 14%, so you have to get up and get out of the saddle. You want to be able to hold the same position each time. So I've done this on hills that are, a mile long, 5 or 6% mile long hill with curves that you find in the Berkeley Hills. And a 5% hill ordinarily would let me get up to speeds which are too high to make the turns, which is why I have to hit the brakes on the way down. But it's a sort of same thing. I would look for at least, 60 seconds, 90-second long hill. If it's a 3 or 4 minute hill, that's fine. The shorter the hill, the more replicates you can do.
Okay. So if you can find I'm guessing you're the hardest you're going to go up the hill is kind of what you need to base the time off of, right? So if you're going to go up at VO2,
then you're limited to a 5-minute hill.
You want to find one that you can do 90 seconds. Well, we don't have any 5-minute hills around here, so not many. That's why I'm interested in the shortest climb that is available. Can you do this on a 1% false flat?
Yes, you can.
And turn around.
And if it's 1%, then as long as it's not too twisty, not too windy, you might be able to go all the way back down without hitting the brake until you get down to the bottom. And if you don't use the brake, then it's even better, because then it looks just like an out and back.
Yeah. Okay.
So you would analyze it just like an out and back.
Perfect. Okay. So really for the single direction climb, we're looking for something that's 60 to 90 seconds, shallow enough that you can do it without standing up, and steep enough that it gives you some data that
so you
couldn't get otherwise. So if you're able to come back down without hitting the brakes, you might as well do the other method.
The key is to do it at widely varying speeds. So you can actually do a thing. You don't need to do a constant slow speed. You can speed up and then slow down, speed up and then slow down. That will work also. These are pretty flexible protocols. You don't really have to keep speed.
Yeah.
For me, my limitation is that I'm low powered, even in the best of times. So.
Yeah. You and I both. So. Okay, so yeah, I mean, you could do one where you're doing 3 or 4 runs and you're going slow for a while.
Exactly. You don't need to do the entire run
slow.
You don't have to do the entire run fast, but it's useful to have varying speed.
Okay. Perfect. And then I think that sounds easy enough, but the other method I think we kind of chatted about before was not having a power meter, doing a coast down, that I think some people were probably familiar with. Can you kind of walk us through? I'm guessing you kind of find that same hill and
right.
Down
so
the other direction.
One of the interesting things about that is that as we're just talking, a 1% hill is probably perfect for that, and you want to do that at you want to vary your speeds, so you're going to do one coast down the hill at very close to starting off at 0 speed. And then you're going to do a second run when you've started off and you're going and you hit the top of the hill or your mark at walking speed. And then you're going to do a third run where you're accelerating, you're going pretty fast by the time you hit your mark, and then you're going to coast down. Now, one thing that I've noticed, it's hard for me to do because I'm not used to this, but it's often better to soft pedal so that you're adding 0 power through the pedals, but your legs, I've noticed that I get more consistent when I'm doing these 0 power coast downs down a shallow grade to keep my legs rotating rather than, because I can't always remember, did I have my left leg up? Did I have my right leg up? Did I have my left leg forward?
Yeah.
It's like, so it's easier for me to just think, okay, I'm going to coast, but I'm going to soft pedal once I hit my start mark, and then I'm just going to soft pedal all the way down to the bottom of the hill, of the 1% hill. And then you take all of that and you put it back into Golden Cheetah, and you have to match up the gradients. And only if you do it 3 times, there's only going to be one solution, which is going to give you the same CdA and the same CRR. And the same total drop, because you know that, I don't know, your total drop, you can look it up on a topo map, or, if you are friends with the Public Works Department, they probably know the gradient exactly, and you'll be able to match it. And they'll say, oh, it's to they know to centimeter accuracy the drop of the roads that they build. So if you chat up a friend in the Public Works Department, and bring him a 6-pack and ask him, how much level differential is there on this road?
Yeah. Okay. So on that one, when you're stopping, right, you start at your mark at, 0 and then walking and then faster. When you get to your end mark,
I do one of two things. I used to, when I was first doing this thing, I taped a car mat to the ground, and I could see the spike in the VE when I hit the car mat, because it works like you're going through a sand pit. It slows you down enough, so it looks like you're decelerating, and it looks like you hit a wall, or But now, after I convinced myself that would work, then once I passed, the tree or the garbage can or the driveway that marks the end of the thing, then I just hit my brakes real hard, and then I create an artificial wall.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I mean, that seems pretty easy. Roll down at different speeds, don't add any power, hit the brakes when you get to your mark, and then plug it all into Golden Cheetah. So
these are pretty flexible.
I think I had a pretty good idea a decent idea of going into this when I tried to do this testing, and I think when we go back out and do it again, we have a whole slew of things that we want to test. After going to the wind tunnel, we were kind of limited on the number of things that we could bring all at once.
I mean, that's the problem with wind tunnels are so cool.
I got plenty of Saturdays, so.
I mean, I would live in a wind tunnel if I could afford it, but I can't, so I had to come up with this method.
Yeah. No, I think this is great. And people at home, we were lucky enough. We had Josh and actually one of the engineers over at Factor Bikes came down with us, and so we had two guys that probably spent a cumulative 40 or 50 years in the wind tunnel. If it was just me in there, they would have handed me a file, and I would have gone, I don't really know what to do with all of this data. So luckily we had them to kind of parse through that, and not everybody at home has that, but you can do this and download a free software and have a pretty good idea of which equipment choice is better. What I think one of the things that we were going to talk about here is that you can record or test bags, helmets, clothing, tires, tire pressure. So really once you kind of decide, okay, if you're doing an Unbound like me, I'm going to run the Pirelli Cinturato H in a 45. Well, what pressure should I use? You can come to SILCA's calculator. We always say that's a good starting point. If it recommends 31 and 32 PSI in front and rear, now I can go out and what happens when I do 28 PSI and 30 and 32, and I can make my own calculation for that surface.
So I think that just so that you understand, when we're trying to get a separate estimate of both CdA and CRR, you are really looking for. Let me back up a second, and this. Rolling resistance varies linearly with speed, and aerodynamic resistance varies with the cube of speed. I said that incorrectly. Rolling resistance is actually independent of speed, and aerodynamic drag varies with the square of speed. But the power that you need to overcome rolling resistance and the power you need to overcome aerodynamic resistance varies either linearly or with the cube of speed. So that's why you need a big range of speeds. If you're trying to separately measure CdA and separately measure CRR, you need a big range of speeds, which is why when you were saying that your laps in your previous tests were almost all the same power, that wasn't enough to give us an edge to lever out the difference between, to pry apart the difference between CdA and CRR. That's why when you do these coast downs, I say, or the hill climbs, I say you do one at very low speed and then you do one at very high speed. It's so that you can, when you're trying to estimate those different components, you need to you need to have enough range so that you can separate the part that varies linearly and the part that varies with the cube. And that's also the reason why you need to have a separate speed sensor, a dedicated speed sensor, because you're trying to estimate something that varies linearly and varies with the cube.
And that's kind of the beauty of the math of all this, right? Is the linearity and exponential nature of Aero versus
So this
resistance.
Graphic that we've had up here for all this time that no one is looking at anymore, but it's been staring at us. It was easy for us to tell that the drag was higher in the first case, but we didn't know, because you didn't vary the speed very much and you didn't vary the power very much. It was very difficult for us to know, was that difference because of an Aero difference, or is that difference because of a CRR, rolling resistance difference? There wasn't enough variation in speed and power. But in your case, you're interested in this piece, so you need to get a wide variation in speed and power. Do I sound like a professor?
Okay. Well, yeah, I don't think you can break it out of you, right?
I'm afraid it's in there.
So, yeah, I think the next test it'll be some easy runs, some hard runs, somewhere in between, and then we'll be able to get a lot better data to parse out. So awesome. Well, great. I think you answered a ton of my questions, and I hope that answers a bunch of questions for everybody listening. And
if they're still awake,
step-by-step guide, I think we'll probably link here in the description. Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. We'll put it in a link in the description, kind of with some of the step-by-step instructions and things like that. And then they can sit here and listen to us chat about rolling resistance and CdA for an hour.
This was fun, Travis.
Awesome. Well, Robert, I had a blast. So I tell people all the time, I'll sit here and talk about tire pressure and aerodynamics and all the nerdy stuff all day long. So
thanks a lot, then.
Awesome. Well, I appreciate you coming on and taking time out of your day, and I'm sure you got to get back to grading papers and writing lectures. So
we'll catch you next time.